The orcs are probably the most numerous mortal species in the entire galaxy, and their wars blight the Milky Way almost everywhere. Many warlords seek to conquer pretty much everything for their gods Gork and Mork, for money, or just for the sheer hell of it. But there is one name that I wager nearly every orc knows and that anyone else is right to fear. This warlord claims to be the prophet of Gork and Mork themselves, and while some say this may just be delusion as opposed to reality, he has the charisma, the power, and the smarts to back up nearly everything he says. He leads perhaps the largest Waaagh since the days of the Beast, bringing many powerful allies to his banner and raising his acolytes to near legendary status merely by association. In his own words, he is going to stomp the universe flat and kill anything that fights back. He is the prophet of the Waaagh, the beast of Armageddon. He is Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. Some say that the Eldari craft world of Ulthwé was indirectly responsible for the rise of Ghazghkull Thraka, as they intervened to protect another craft world named Idere from an Ork Waaagh. Why exactly there is a correlation between these incidents is unclear. I assume the intervention confined the Waaagh to a planet or created a power vacuum that would later be filled by Ghazghkull, but whatever the consequences of the actions, and whether they even mattered at all, things began to come together on the Orcish side in about 932 M41. It all began on the planet of Uruk Thraka, a world that had been held by humans in the Dark Age of technology, then by other races, then by humans again after the Dark Angels came in the Great Crusade, then finally fell to the Orcs after the coming of the Beast in M32. The Greenskins named the planet Urk, presumably because Uruk Thraka was too hard to say, and after millennia of warring amongst themselves, a space marine force came to the planet in an attempt to disrupt them. Unfortunately, an orc boy from the Goth clan named Ghazghkull caught a bolt round to the head and suffered massive cranial injuries, pulped brain parts and all. Only the ridiculous resilience of the orcoid species kept him alive long enough to stagger away from the battlefield somewhat, finding his way to an orc medical tent belonging to the Death Skull pain boy named Mad Doc Grotznik. Other stories suggest that Grotznik found Ghazghkull on the battlefield, but I suspect the more badass version is more likely to be true just because it's Ghazghkull. Either way, the Doc sensed an opportunity and replaced the pulped and broken brain bits of the orc with adamantium bionics. And then something weird happened. In any species that wasn't an orc, I'd basically call this going insane as a result of the massive brain damage caused by the injuries suffered. But with Ghazghkull, it seems as though some latent power, presumably something psychic, was awakened within him. He might well have been insane, but given some of the things he's been capable of doing since, I can't put it down to anything else. Basically, Ghazghkull believed that he was capable of communing directly with and was even blessed by the Orc gods, the brutal but cunning Gork and the cunning but brutal Mork. And whilst any Orc might have such ridiculous delusions, Ghazghkull was able to back it up with actions. Within 6 years, he had gone from an Orc boy to the war boss of his particular tribe. This rise was practically meteoric as far as we can tell, implying that something was favouring Ghazghkull, lending further credence to his claims of being Gork and Mork's champion. But there was more to the now war boss than just brawn and some big ideas. Any orcs, particularly those of the vicious Goth clan, can have plenty of those. Ghazghkull had something more than all others since perhaps the orc who had last conquered Urk. He had charisma, he had vision, and he had the ability to unite the orcs under his banner. Within a year of making the rank of war boss within his tribe, it is believed he had subjugated the entirety of Urk, no small feat given the diversity of clans believed to be upon it. And yet, the nature of orcs meant that Waaagh Ghazghkull may have never got going at all, but two events coincided to properly set things into motion. First, a space hulk arrived in the Zornian system where Urk was found, which allowed the orcs to get off-world and launch a proper Waaagh. and around the same time, the system's star began to die. I presume it was in the red giant phase or white dwarf phase, given there was no supernova that we know of, but it was interpreted by Ghazghkull as a sign from Gork and Mork to get out and go conquer the stars. Preparations were made, the Hulk was secured, and the united Waaagh Ghazghkull set off on what would become the most infamous Ork invasion in millennia. Renamed World Killer by the Orks, the Hulk found itself in the Immaterium en route to wherever it so happened to end up, but due to multiple power failures, it was repeatedly invaded by demonic forces. This would be a bad thing 99.9% of the time, but this is Orks, and they live to fight. And under the command of Ghazghkull, they saw off the demons and grew stronger from it as a result. In combination with the constant wars on Urk and the skirmishes with the Space Marines before Ghazghkull's injury, this made the Orks both experienced and assumedly larger than typical, since greenskins do increase in size by fighting. As a result, when World Killer translated back into reality, whatever world they ran into was likely in for all sorts of trouble. And unfortunately for the Imperium of Man, said world was the vital hive world formerly known as Ullanor. Yep, Armageddon was about to be invaded, something of a homecoming for you, if you like, for the Orks, since they'd held and even ruled from Ullanor both in the Great Crusade and during the War of the Beast. Whether Ghazghkull had intended for Armageddon to be invaded at least on this occasion is unclear. If I recall correctly, it wasn't planned, since Orks generally don't aim their Space Hulks, but Gork and Mork may have somehow directed it subconsciously or more obviously. I can't quite remember, and I do apologise for that. Maybe I'll be able to find something in the deeper research. Either way, when World Killer arrived at Armageddon, having smashed the rest of the system, a lone distress call went up from the now legendary Commissar Yarrick, but reinforcement would not arrive before the landing of the Orks, and oh, what a landing. Ghazghkull declared he did not need the Hulk anymore to leave, since he planned to take the whole planet, so he just crashed it down on the planet rather than launching dropships or whatever else, causing massive devastation. And so, on the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 941 M41, the Second War for Armageddon was on. If you haven't heard of the first, I suggest maybe looking at the Logan Grimnar log, perhaps amongst a couple of others. This war was incredibly one-sided in its opening exchanges. Armageddon was ruled at the time by a rather incompetent overlord who you may have heard of by the name of Hermann von Straub, and all the warnings of the Ork threat were ignored to the planet's detriment. The Armageddon PDF was smashed on both attack and defense. The main continent of Armageddon Prime was pretty much swept before it knew what hit it, and the equatorial jungles believed by von Straub to be impenetrable were little obstacle either. Within days, Armageddon Secundus was being hit hard too. Even full Titan legions couldn't stem the tide, though the Legio Metallica did cause serious damage before being all but wiped out in return. Infernus Hive surrendered pretty much without a fight, with its refugees being herded back and enslaved by the Orks, and though there are no records of Ghazghkull personally taking the field in this time, his command will have absolutely helped the fight go the Greenskins' way. When he did get involved was when things began to stall for the Orks, particularly at the siege of Hades' Hive that the now exiled Commissar Yarrick was managing to keep going far beyond any logic. Everything Ghazghkull could concoct or was told to try by Gork and Mork was countered by the wily old Commissar, and the defence was so inspiring that even the other hives took note and put up much better fights as a result. Though Ghazghkull would eventually smash Hades open and almost kill Yarrick, the Commissar and the Armageddon Steel Legion had done their job. The call for reinforcement had been answered, and the reinforcement had come in the form of the Space Marines. Led by Blood Angel's Chapter Master Dante, the Astartes saved Acheron Hive from falling to the Orks, though they could not prevent Ghazghkull from taking Hades. The surge in Imperial morale did spread rumours of the war boss's death, But despite Dante making an actual assassination attempt, they were proven false in the final major battle of the war, a last gasp attack on Tartarus High that was repulsed as the Orcs retreated behind the equatorial jungles and Ghazghkull eventually left Armageddon. In the years following Armageddon's Second War, many war bosses would have been overthrown by arrogant underlings for their incompetence and failure. But if Ghazghkull faced many of these challenges, then they probably ended very quickly and very messily for the upstarts in question. For his part, the self-styled Prophet of the Waaagh was doing a lot of ruminating on his defeat, with Gork and Mork, or whatever the voices in his head are, chiming in too. According to them, the entire invasion of Armageddon had been just a warm-up, a way to test how the Imperium would handle a major assault as well as probe at its defences. It was decided either then or later that there would be another attack on Armageddon at some point, but for now, Ghazghkull had work to do. I cannot recall quite how many worlds and systems were assaulted by the weakened but still powerful Waaagh Ghazghkull in this time, but assumedly it was a lot. The destruction of the Astral Drakes chapter and the looting of Dinostics 5 are both undated, but may have been in this period. The first particularly famous and dated one I could find was the invasion of the mining world known as Piscina 4, a world that was also used for recruitment by the Dark Angel Space Marines. This battle saw Ghazghkull ally with the Bad Moon's warlord Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub and his chief mech boy Orkimedes. The mech had invented a revolutionary system known as the Teleporter, and Piscina 4's invasion would serve as a field test for the teleportation devices. Running battles with the Dark Angel's 10th Company and later forces of both the 3rd Company and the Deathwing eventually saw the Orcs repulsed from the world, but Ghazghkull had left long before victory was assured. Though they eventually fell out because they're Orcs and that's what they do, Nazdreg and Ghazghkull had made a deal. The Bad Moon boss would continue the war for Piscina 4 that he probably wouldn't have been able to start without the help of Ghazghkull, in return for Orkimedes and the understanding of the teleporter design that came with him. Following Piscina, Ghazghkull headed for the Gulgotha sector, a mineral-rich region that he planned to effectively convert into a giant ammo factory that would equip his Waaagh in preparation for the return to Armageddon. History does not record much of the conquest, as it seems to have been a pretty simple undertaking for the Orcs, but history does record what happened toward the end of it. You see, the Imperium may have widely put the Second Armageddon War behind it, but some remembered what Ghazghkull had done and refused to let his plans continue, whether they involved a return or not. In particular, Commissar Yarrick wasn't done with the Warlord, and he and an Imperial force managed to hunt Ghazghkull down in Golgotha. Yarrick even brought his own personal Baneblade, the Fortress of Arrogance, to the battle that was planned to put the so-called Beast of Armageddon down, but said plan failed horribly. The Orcs had the Imperials vastly outnumbered and probably outgunned to boot, and it was nothing short of a disaster for the humans. Even Yarrick was unable to retreat or escape, instead being crushed by one of the Orc battle fortresses and captured. He probably should have died, given what I know of battle fortresses, but this is Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, and he just doesn't know what dying is. Yarrick was brought to Ghazghkull, and though he was idly tortured for a few weeks, the Commissar was eventually released. Ghazghkull's logic here was simple. He was going back to Armageddon, and since only Yarrick was a respectable human fighter in his eyes, he set him free to ensure that he'd have a proper fight when he got there. And so it was that more than half a century after his initial attempt at conquest had begun, the Prophet of the Waaagh had a free hit and a second crack at taking Armageddon. The Imperium was much better prepared for him this time, however. Massive amounts of Space Marine and Astra Militarum forces had already assembled on the planet before the Orcs even arrived in system. That said, Ghazghkull had assembled a much larger Orc force too, and the thin Imperial Navy cordon didn't last all that long before being destroyed or forced to disengage. This left the Orcs free to launch possibly the largest ground invasion seen in the modern era, using a combination of the asteroids known as rocks and their newly inbuilt teleporter systems to bring vast amounts of troops and supplies down in far more safety than the Imperials would have liked. Sure, most were shot down, but every single one that got to ground intact pretty much had a near infinite supply of warriors, supplies and war machines ready to deploy from it thanks to the teleporters. And thus 57 years to the day after it had arrived the first time, Waaagh Ghazghkull was back on Armageddon, and it wasn't going down so easily. In what is believed an act of vengeance as well as a statement of intent, Ghazghkull's opening gambit was to annihilate Hades' hive from orbit. There would be no repeats of past mistakes here. The world was his, and no one was stopping him. And as if the Prophet of the Waaagh didn't have enough orcs on his side already, the fact that they'd been to Armageddon before meant that a population of feral orcs had matured from the spores left behind in Armageddon's jungles. And then, as if it weren't hard enough for the Imperials, they lost Acheron Hive basically without a shot being fired. Somehow, Hermann von Straub had managed to overthrow the hive and was now openly working with the enemy. Much like the second war, the orcs were off to a powerful start in the third one, and it was up to Yarrick, who was now in command of the Imperial defence, and his allies to turn the tide. Despite submersible assaults causing the loss of its dockyards, Hell's Reach Hive just about held thanks to the heroics of Titans, Black Templars and many more. The legendary Penal Legion, known as Schaefer's Last Chances, managed to infiltrate Acheron Hive, slaying von Straub even if this wasn't enough to bring it back to Imperial control. It wasn't great, but the Imperials were making up for their early losses and maybe, just maybe, were beginning to swing the war. But they never got the chance to find out. You see, Armageddon has some pretty crazy weather, and before we'd even had records of Ghazghkull taking the field, he's probably the most backseat general of an orc that I know, the season of fire broke out. This caused the temperatures outside of the hives to skyrocket, even to levels that the orcs couldn't withstand, and so a stalemate was enforced for a time as each side retreated to the hives that they held. The orcs had about half the planet by this point, maybe a little bit less, but rather like at Hades in the Second War, Ghazghkull's patience ran out. He grew bored and delegated the remainder of the conflict to his subordinate bosses before setting off to find something better to do. It's also believed that Gork and Mork had been supplying Ghazghkull with visions, calling him to parts unknown, as part of what would be termed as the Great Waaagh, but more on that in a moment. And of course, Yarrick couldn't let go, joining the Black Templars as they pursued the withdrawing elements of the Orc fleet. We're unsure exactly how long the chase went on, but it came to an end in the region of space known as the Haunted Gulf. The Orcs fought hard, but for once Ghazghkull didn't have the upper hand, as the combined Imperial fleet crippled ship after ship after ship. Eventually, only the Prophet's newer flagship Killwrecker was left standing, but as Yarrick and co prepared to board, something else weird happened. Ghazghkull's visions went a little bit over the top, and he suffered a massive splitting headache as his weird boys went into a mass vision/trance-like state. It was as if the gods themselves were speaking through the weird boys to tell their prophet what to do. And what he was to do was very, very simple. Create the largest Waaagh ever seen, unite the orcs, and conquer everything else. The Waaagh energy generated from this conversation pulsed like an EMP, paralysing the Imperial ships as it grasped Killwrecker and dragged it into the Immaterium toward parts unknown. After being chucked into the warp by the Waaagh energy, Ghazghkull and co returned to real space far from Armageddon, not that far from the orc-held Octarius sector of Ultima Segmentum, if I have my facts right. It's just southeast of the centre of the galaxy, give or take a bit. It is actually believed that the warp tear left behind from their departure would go on to merge with the Cicatrix Maledictum, known to the orcs as Gorg's Grin, but that came later, much later for Ghazghkull than others, as it so happens. You see, The warp, as far as we know, decided to pull some timey-wimey shenanigans and transport Killwrecker back in time slightly, as well as chucking it through the Immaterium. Yes, I know space and time are intrinsically connected, but not everyone has an education in general relativity, and it's the warp, it doesn't play by physical rules. Please don't call me out for getting space and time separate, and it's actually space-time, I know. Around the time of their arrival, Octarius itself was being assailed by a massive Tyranid invasion. The now exiled Inquisitor Cryptman had subtly directed High Fleet Leviathan there, expecting the Orcs and Tyranids to keep each other occupied and maybe wipe each other out. This plan, of course, backfired as both forces grew stronger and stronger and eventually spilled out from the war zone, but for the time being, it was a war where the Tyranids had made huge strides over the Greenskins. Ghazghkull's arrival changed all that. Once he'd announced his arrival by smashing up the nearest Ork Warlord's retinue and inviting him to the newly formed Great Waaagh, he amassed a huge Ork army within weeks. Some call it the greatest Ork migration ever, or at least the beginnings of it. From there, the Waaagh headed for Octarius, as Ghazghkull would need even more Orcs to achieve his goals, and he fancied another good fight. And he also had in mind to show Octarius, his current ruler, Overfiend Zog Steeltooth, what a true overlord looked like. By the time Ghazghkull arrived, only the capital world of Octarius, or Octaria, or Octavius seemed to be left in Orc hands, and it too was already under assault from the Hive Mind's minions. The province of the Waaagh was probably more than happy to see it like that. It meant that there were plenty of Tyranids to fight, and it would show all in Octarius that he was the one to lead them over the current Overfiend should he bail them out. And bail them out he did. His forces made planetfall, causing huge damage to the Tyranids and inspiring a counterattack from the Overfiend's forces. Unlike on Armageddon, where he'd often been content to lead from the back, Ghazghkull was front and centre in this battle, carving up Tyranids with a fresh fervour after his chat with Gork and Mork. But as his and Steeltooth's forces came together and/or he headed within sight of their fortifications, things got a little bit difficult. And by that, I mean that the ground shook and a massive bioform known as a Morlock burst from it, swallowing Ghazghkull whole in one fell swoop. As near as a Tyranid versus Orc battle probably gets to stunned silence would have presumably fallen over the battlefield at that point. The prophet of the Waaagh was possibly dead, except he wasn't. Almost immediately, the Morlock began to convulse in pain, and soon after, Ghazghkull ripped his way from the creature's insides, probably barely even harmed by the ordeal because he's just that tough. The Orcs roared in triumph, and the Tyranids were driven from that particular battlefield in short order by the combined forces of the Greenskins. In the aftermath, Overfiend Steeltooth pledged himself to Ghazghkull, and Octarius' war escalated to a scale perhaps even beyond Armageddon as both races continued to grow in strength. Certainly Ghazghkull saw more potential in Octarius than he did in Armageddon as presumably the ultimate fight without end. But even then, he was not content to stay and fight forever like almost any other Orc would. Instead, he left Octarius, with assumedly Steeltooth taking command once again. But by this time, the Waaagh energy being generated by the war was something crazy and having some very interesting consequences. This energy has pulsed through the warp, with every psychic individual taking note and, if they understood what it meant, panicking about it, and it acts as a giant beacon drawing ever more Orcs to the battle. This same phenomenon, along with word of mouth, is what drew so many Orcs to Armageddon, and as Ghazghkull's infamy has grown and the numbers following him have grown too. It's also applied to his Great Waaagh. The fleet directly under him is rumoured to be around 5 million ships, a frankly terrifying number, and worse still, no one quite knows where it even is. There have been simultaneous reports personally placing Ghazghkull on Octarius, in the war zone around the Forge World of Ryza, and even on the other side of the Cicatrix Maledictum entirely in Imperium Nihilus once that appeared. Some believe that the Orcs are using warp storms as a means of travelling across the galaxy, and their lack of physical compliance may explain why the Warlord has been seen in several places at once, because apparently duality and paradoxes just isn't a thing that Ghazghkull cares about. Others believe that it is due to a more scientific reason, time dilation due to the warp causing signals sent at different times to arrive together. It's even a thing when you don't factor the warp in, so adding in all that empiric activity, it makes it kind of totally plausible, I think. Whatever the case, it is causing major headaches for Imperial forces, and if Yarrick and the Black Templars are still attempting to pursue Ghazghkull, they're probably not having much fun in doing it. As for why he's all over the place, Ghazghkull is still following the plan laid out during the battle in the Haunted Gulf. Unite the Orcs under his banner and bring about the Ragnarork, a sort of never-ending, all-consuming war that some say would even bring Gork and Mork themselves into reality. And if you ask the Orcs if it was working, they'd say yes, for one simple reason: Gork's grin. As mentioned earlier, that's the Orc name for the Cicatrix Maledictum, and it's a very literal one, perhaps unsurprisingly. The Orcs believe that the Great Rift is Gork's mouth, an attempt by their brutal but cunning god to swallow the galaxy and vomit out the undesirable Chaos armies spewing from the rift for the Orcs to fight. As for why it's named after Gork, it's probably because Mork is far too cunning for that sort of an approach, though I can't verify that. Thus, if you asked an Orc who knew what you were on about whether this was the coming of the Ragnarork, they'd say yes. Gork's grin is the start, and it's encouraging all the Orcs around the galaxy to get in on the fight by just endlessly chucking Chaos forces at them. Add in Ghazghkull's ever-expanding Waaagh that's seemingly all over the place at once, and you start to sort of see their logic, even if the Montieva is actually nothing to do with the Orc gods and is presumably due to the events of the Gathering Storm, but shh, no one tell the Orcs. Oh, and one final word on Ghazghkull. He's not forgotten about Armageddon despite not fighting there for presumably centuries by now. Through some unbelievable, ridiculous power that I don't truly understand, he is able to communicate with his lieutenants seemingly by telepathy or through visions, barking out orders and keeping them in line and on task. This isn't just post-Maledictum shenanigans either. He's been doing this since Octarius, and again, no, I have no idea how he's doing it. It's just stupidly impressive, probably more evidence that he's got Gork and Mork in his corner, and I wanted to mention it before I forgot, since we're just about done. And there you have it, a full recap on the tale of Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka. Obviously, I know I've discussed this story in a previous log, but that was a long time ago and split over several parts, so I felt it was worth compiling it all together and updating things for the modern era. And of course, I should point out that the fact that Ghazghkull is all over the place means this tale is ever evolving, but this is where we are, at least as far as I know. Either way, the Prophet of the Waaagh is not someone you want to tangle with. He may not quite be on the same level as the Beast, but he's probably the closest the Orcs have been in millennia to unity and undivided leadership. Here's just hoping that the Ragnarork never comes to pass. It may be a mess at this point, but I quite like this galaxy, and I don't want it overrun by Orcs, thank you very much. But for now, we must move on. Next time I have an idea for what I wish to cover. It'll fill in some gaps, update some situations, and give a nice little look into some of the ancient and modern history of the Imperium. But for now, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.